You're all very welcome here this evening for our webinar, um, where Pastor Jane Stranz will be talking about where next for ecumenical relations. I just want to say that I was in Germany last month at their Katholikentag, and I was most impressed by the multicultural gathering that was there. Society was gathered, not something we see here in Ireland. We're going to have a very interesting presentation coming up shortly now. For about 40 minutes. And then we'll have a question and answer session, which is open to everybody. So it gives you a chance to ask questions either directly or using the chat function as well. We always start our meetings with a prayer. So I'd like to now introduce Christiane Bascu from France, who is leading us in our opening prayer tonight.
Jesus, you are no longer here in flesh and blood, somebody among us, but you want us to feel your presence in our bones. You want us to embody your presence today for the sisters and brothers of our time. You no longer have hands, but you have eyes to attend a sick person, gently stroke an old man's cheek, shake hands with a former enemy. You no longer have eyes, but you have eyes to focus on whoever nobody sees and make him or her feel alive again. You have our lips and smiles to reawaken the will to live and the joy of living in those who lost them on the way.
Thank you, Christiane. Thank you. That was lovely. And now I'd like to call on Jean-Pierre Schmitz. It's thanks to him that we have Pastor Jane Stranz with us here tonight. So to introduce her, over to you, Jean-Pierre Schmitz.
First, I'd like to say that I'm very happy to introduce Jane because we know each other for now many years, maybe I don't know exactly. And since we are Church International, we have members for many countries, mainly Europe, but also on other continents. And Jane is a native from the UK. She studied in Oxford, and then she also studied in Germany, and especially in Wittenberg. Wittenberg is an important city for the city where Martin Luther lived for a long time, I guess. And she's living in France. She has been living here in France for many years. And she also had some trip outside of Europe. So since she lived in three countries in Europe, she's fully fluent in three languages: English, German, and French. And now she is a pastor of French United Protestant Church in France. She is in charge of a parish in Courbevoie, which is the place where I live, very close, a suburb to Paris, western part of Paris, and very near our home. And it's also near La Défense, which is a very important business center, which was started almost half a century ago. And the parish is very active, and due to that location, there are many people from various countries who attend that parish, and mainly Africa, but also from other continents, for example, from the US, and also other countries. And I want to point out that in that parish, those who attend. Among those who attend, there are many, not many, but a significant number of Catholics who either go again to their parish, and some of them have completely abandoned their Catholic, and now they only go to the Protestant Church. So in our French Federation party, we invited Jane. It was last November to our General Assembly, and she participated to a round table with two other younger people, which was a very good debate. And the theme was Spanish spirit of Jesus and the art of living in the world inspired humanism. Jane also had important responsibility in the Protestant Church, in ecumenical structures in France and in last year, also in Geneva. I think she said as she said before, and in France she was member of or with responsibility of the secretary of the Council, Ecumenical Council of the Church in Geneva. This was in Geneva, but also in France, responsible of ecumenical relation in the Protestant Federation of France, Fédération Protestante de France. So I think Jane chose the text, the title of her conference tonight. We are next for the ecumenical relation. I think the important point is next, which seems that we are in movement, and this seems to me very important. The future, we have to invent, to find some new ways to develop ecumenical relations. That's the main points I wanted to say about Jane, and of course she will say a lot more during her talk. And just two small points. She likes very much origami. Origami, you know, that is Japanese paper foldings. She's very expert. And also she hates Brexit. Don't ask a question about Brexit, because I think she would not be happy about that. Okay, so now, Jane, je te laisse la parole.
Merci, merci beaucoup, Jean-Pierre. I will, however, continue in English, although that may be a bit of an effort for me to continue in English. I will try to remember to do that. Well, thank you for inviting me. I have got a sort of, not exactly a PowerPoint, but a presentation which I'll share with you all in a moment. But I wanted to say what a pleasure it is to be with you. I know about our Church International partly through some of my work in Germany. I used to be on the board, on the international board of the Protestant Kirchentag, not the Katholikentag, but the Protestant Kirchentag. And I'll mention one or two things about the Ecumenical German Kirchentag. Just one or two things in what I'll say later on if I manage to get that far. And I wanted to just say, bring you greetings also from something called the CCBF, which is the Conférence Catholique Francophone des Baptisés. And you had Anne Soupa, I believe, with you a month ago, and she founded that. And I think really, I don't do anything on the board of that, but I'm a member of the board. So I see all the emails going backwards and forwards, which is always quite interesting. And I try to support the person who was the former president of that, Paul Zelich. So I'm going to try and share a screen with you now, and we'll see whether that works. And I'm not going to say everything that's on the paper, but I've prepared one or two bits and pieces for you. Some of it is written down, some of it's pictures, and I have actually, I nearly have some origami to share with you right at the very end. If you remind me, I will share some origami with you as well. So here we go. There we are. So the problem with a title is that as soon as you've given a title, you want a different title, because I just thought, oh gosh, I've now given this title about sort of how do we take ecumenical relations forwards. And one of the issues that I've been trying to work with is how do we find images, how do we find paradigms that talk about ecumenism in a way that means something to us today. And I've been trying to work for about 5 or 6 years now on the idea of water, the shape of water, as how to think about ecumenical space. And ecumenical space was something that one of the former general secretaries of the World Council of Churches particularly worked on, Konrad Reiser. And that is a term that's always spoken to me particularly. But it seems now to me that simply talking about space is perhaps no longer enough, and we need something that is dynamic, not only dynamic about sort of going forwards, because of course water does travel. It can also remain stagnant, unfortunately, but something that would talk to us about the present and the past. So what I've tried to sort of put this together as this evening, and I'm not quite sure that it works, is that this is a plea for developing ecumenical relations, which encourages us to enter into and navigate in the delta as an ecumenical space. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about deltas in a moment. And I've got some pictures of a delta that we can move forwards with. And one of the reasons that I wanted to work with water as a term is that, as we know, I mean, often the ecumenical movement is pictured as a boat on waters. I even have a little travel tag on my suitcase that has the ecumenical boat on it that says oikumene, the ecumenical boat. So how we can navigate in spaces that are not as they used to be, but how we can also understand those past spaces. And so you'll see I'll take some other images to do with water forwards. And one of the other things that I'm quite concerned about is that we need committed, knowledgeable and charismatic ecclesial leaders. We also need committed leaders who have integrity in our churches today. And we desperately, it seems to me, need more truly ecumenical leadership within our churches. And it's very difficult for church leaders who may previously have been very involved in ecumenism and in ecumenical relations to take that forwards once they become involved in church leadership and in leading their own churches. It becomes quite problematic sometimes. But we need that ecumenical leadership at all levels, within the dicastery for the promotion of Christian unity in Rome, within the World Council of Churches, within the Orthodox churches, and within the World Evangelical Alliance. But it seems to me that we all have that capacity to be ecumenical leaders ourselves. Christians who are the grassroots members of churches also need to take up ecumenical issues. And so what I'm trying to do tonight is, there's certain things that maybe only specialists might understand, but I'm really wanting to encourage you, all of you, to take up ecumenism as something that you can do locally, maybe nationally, obviously internationally within We Are Church internationally, and encourage us to develop relationships and projects and conversations. And it's only if we all take responsibility that we can make sure that Christianity is not habitually represented by photos of male church leaders, for the most part, obviously with one or two exceptions. So let's go forwards into the Delta together. And you'll have seen that and what will come up all the time at the top of the things I've prepared how do we take ecumenical relations forwards in a time of flux, fracture and fragmentation, and how do we take things forwards in a time of control, compassion and complexity as well. And I'm very aware as I speak to you, I mean, Jean-Pierre has already mentioned this, we are at the 10th anniversary of Brexit. It breaks my heart, but that is where we are, in the UK at least, and it has created lots of problems for me personally as a British person living in France. But, you know, there's lots of things around us that speak to this. And so I start with this wonderful place, which is actually closed to visitors at the moment. It is the chapel of the Ecumenical Centre in Geneva, which was the space, the building where the World Council of Churches, the Lutheran World Federation, for a while also the Conference of European Churches and the World Communion of Reformed Churches, amongst many other smaller organisations, had their headquarters. And it's at the moment a building site, unfortunately. But I wanted to start with this picture because that ecumenical chapel is something that I must have given guided visits to in a number of different languages to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of visitors to Geneva. And when you go into that space, it's a space which is actually like going down into a baptistry, and all of the walkways are represented to some extent by water. And so as I was thinking about using water as a way to talk about ecumenical relations, this beautiful place where I was fortunate enough to pray, not quite every day, but very often, came back to me. And this idea that literally in this space, this ecumenical space, we walked on water to get to the places where we sat down every time we entered the chapel. And we walked past a mosaic of Christ's baptism in the Jordan as we walked in, but there was no holy water to make the sign of the cross. So this particular chapel was a place where we would come home, but it would also be a place where we were disabled. So I wanted us to encourage you to think about the oikoumene, the whole inhabited world, not as a reality that's knocking at our gate, that it's something that's outside us. It's the whole inhabited earth. It's deeply embedded within us, and we are fully part of it. That's my vision of it in any case. And but navigating it really requires that we embrace complexity and a sense of shared responsibility as well. So here's a picture of me not looking like I am this evening, but in my pastoral gear. I don't always wear my Geneva gown, but you can't really see it because the photo's too small. But in one hand there is a glass of Prosecco, I think, and in the other is my mobile phone. So it's about communication. It's also about joy. I'm smiling. This was at my installation service here in Courbevoie. I don't take myself too seriously a lot of the time, I hope. But I also wanted to say a little bit about my background. I'm not an Anglican, although I come from England, or where I was born. I come from the United Reformed Church, and that church really formed my ecumenical commitment. I grew up in an ecumenical parish, in a local ecumenical project, which was very much part of the reality of 1970s, 1980s, 1990s English church life in all sorts of ways, not just in England, obviously, in other parts of the British Isles and the United Kingdom as well. And I wanted to read you just one part of the basis of union of the United Reformed Church, which is a united church formed which came into being in 1972. The United Reformed Church has been formed in obedience to the call to repent of what has been amiss in the past and to be reconciled. It sees its formation and growth as a part of what God is doing to make his people one, and as a united church will take wherever possible and with all speed further steps towards the unity of all God's people. And when I was only 9 years old in 1972, but in my local church, we moved into a new building in the town centre. And I can remember standing up around about the age of 12 in 1976 and saying this, and it had an enormous impact on me. And I just thought, yes, I am willing to give up what I understand this church to be in order for the greater unity of the church. And so I suppose that made me think, looking back at it now as a theologian, which I certainly wasn't then, ecumenism touched me at that point. And I think that it was this idea of a sort of kenotic ecumenism. I wouldn't want to, an ecumenism that is not based on identity, which is where a lot of ecumenical dialogue is. We tried to have quite firm identities within ecumenical dialogue in order to be clear about where we're coming from, to be able to say, well, you believe this, we believe that, we can go this far, but we can't go any further. What really touched me about ecumenism from quite a young age is this idea of an ecumenism that changes me, that makes me leave identity behind. And that was all part of a whole movement in the late 70s and then the early 80s in England, where there was this effort to come together between Anglicans, Methodists, the United Reformed Church and some other churches in what was called a covenanting process. And at the time, that process failed in the early 1980s. And we had been, many of us, very, very invested in that. And it failed because of the issue of women priests at the time, because several of our churches had women who were ordained, and the Church of England did not yet have ordained women priests. And it felt that it couldn't go forwards really with this wider project of unity simply because of that issue. And I wouldn't have called myself a feminist at the time, but it was quite a bitter pill, especially as my local church was Anglican, Methodist and United Reformed. And so I began, if you like, my ecumenical journey and my journey to become a minister with really in the middle of that, the time of that failure for us to come to greater unity. And these days, the United Reformed Church is very, very small, much smaller than it was when I first came to France 35 years ago now, when I was sent by my church to work with the French Reformed Church at that time. And now the church I'm part of here has also become a united church, and I'm delighted about that. And for reasons that who knows why, I happen to be serving the Lutheran part of one of the Lutheran parishes in our church, one of the minority parts of the United Protestant Church. I've put another couple of quotes up there that come from the World Council of Churches basis, which I won't read out for you now, but I will read out the rather complicated formulation of something called the Lunt principle, which comes from 1952. And this also is sort of something that inspires me, which I would aspire to, and which I find incredibly, incredibly difficult in my local work and in all other kinds of work as well, ecumenically. Should not our churches ask themselves whether they are showing sufficient eagerness to enter into conversation with other churches, and whether they should not act together in all matters except those in which deep differences of conviction compel them to act separately? The Lunt Principle, 1952, Faith and Order. And there's this idea that I still hold strongly to, and which many people refer to in ecumenical dialogue and in ecumenical conversations. We are far, far away from that guiding principle to do all those things together that we can do together, and only do apart those things that we can do apart. And yet, this coming Sunday here in our area, we have a meeting of all of the Green Church organisations in our area, and we are trying to do that together. But I still get quite frustrated by the fact that it's seen as sort of something, oh, Catholics need to do it like this, and Protestants need to do it like this, and Orthodox need to do it like this. And then I see things like Green Anglican and Green Lutheran, and I just think, well, this is really something we can do together, and yet we're still putting sort of identity sort of stickers on it. So I sometimes get a bit frustrated about that. So 2 things that help you sort of know a little bit more about where I come from. I should also add that in my home country, in Britain, I am a 2nd generation immigrant. My father fled Hitler's Germany in 1939 and arrived as a 15-year-old migrant, a refugee, in 1939 to England. But my mother, who is still alive, is still living in the village in which she was born, and she'll be 87 later on this year. So let's go onwards. Let's move back to the theme now of water. And you can see where I got the idea for water from. This is a picture, an old picture, a 15-year-old picture of the World Council of Churches history. And it often described itself in terms of a river chart, where you had these different tributaries coming in to make one single river. And I mean, it never actually depicts the sea there, but it's this idea that all things will flow together for an ever bigger picture of unity. It's quite a difficult chart to read. It's obviously you can't see it terribly well, but it charts really the World Council of Churches history since its formation in 1948. And it goes back to around about 1910 to something called the Edinburgh Missionary Conference, which is seen as sort of the founding movement or the founding moment of the modern ecumenical movement, shall we say. But there are lots of questions about how we write ecumenical history, and there is a more up-to-date version of this river chart today, which does at least include Vatican II on it, which this does not, because, I mean, that's not part of the World Council of Churches history necessarily. So how do we write ecumenical history? This doesn't include really the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, because that's 1908 and not 1910. And if we just thought for a moment about the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, it's one of the most well-known international things that happens ecumenically throughout the world, either in January or around Pentecost in many Southern Hemisphere churches and countries. But it's quite interesting, even if we start thinking about the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, founded in 1908, but we don't ever really mention the other weeks of prayer that were launched earlier, like the YMCA and YWCA, the Young Men and Young Women's Christian Association weeks of prayer that were launched in the 1870s, in 1875. And much more, we don't mention the earliest weeks of prayer for unity, for mission, for the mission of the church, bringing Christians together, which were an evangelical initiative in the 1850s, in 1854 and 1856. And there's no space on this diagram here for those things that also almost certainly inspired the ecumenical movement. And of course, the 1908 movement, initially from an Anglican monastery, which then became a monastery which returned to, or would say it returned to, the Roman Catholic Church. That impetus for Christian unity was very much to that the way that those prayers were formulated was about going back to the Roman Catholic Church. It was very much prayers that other Christians should leave their heretical ways and come back to the Roman Catholic Church or to the Catholic Church. So how do we write ecumenical history? It seems to me to be a very important way of thinking about things. And it's also interesting that the World Council has really for many decades decided to write its own history in terms of a river. Today, it also writes that river history differently. It does include Vatican II as part of the ecumenical movement's history and many other elements. But it's important to think about that, especially today, when there is, when we're living in an ever-changing and developing environment of discovery of what is happening in Christianity. I mean, we've got people here who could talk about this much better than me. Hubert van Beek, who's been in charge of ecumenical relations for nearly 40 years at the World Council of Churches, and was then the General Secretary of the Global Christian Forum, could easily tell you much better than I could lots of things about that. But there's a huge growth of Christianity. Christianity is growing. Good news. And you wouldn't think it if you listened to lots of Christians in Europe, I think. So there's huge growth of Christianity in some parts of Africa and Asia. There's, of course, also enormous secularization in parts of the West. But not only, there are also growing churches in many of our countries in the West. And there's also a huge Pentecostalization of spirituality within nearly all churches. There's a Pentecostalization of spirituality, of worship, a Pentecostalization of theology as well. We're learning much more about the place of the Spirit in our theology, and I think that's a very good and important thing. But what's also complicated for the ecumenical movement is that the state-funded churches in Germany and the Nordic churches, we've also traditionally funded the multilateral institutions of the ecumenical movement. They are also undergoing huge changes and deepening secularization. And what we could see is that the emergence of the Global Christian Forum, a much wider table than the World Council of Churches, including far more evangelical and Pentecostal churches, together with other World Council churches, the Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches, and Pentecostal churches, as well as evangelical churches, together with the Roman Catholic Church, has for the moment at least, got a less institutionally focused and more relationally orientated agenda. It's about encountering one another and telling of faith journeys. But what's quite interesting about it, and I think this is really very exciting, is that we're finding that there are both regional and national and even local expressions of the Global Christian Forum, which are beginning to emerge in different parts of the world, and particularly in the Francophone world at the moment. In Belgium, there's been a meeting in Switzerland and in France on 2 occasions as well. So all of these things are emerging and things are changing quite massively. So there's also hostility to ecumenism in all sorts of places. And in lots of ways, it's not dialogue and learning to encounter and be enriched by what others might say to us that is conditioning how we enter into relations. What's much more what tends to happen much more is that people or that churches are trying to sort of make sure that their brand of Christianity is sort of top of the list, and that's also something that does not help, that goes completely against anything to do with the Lund principle. But there are very few of our churches who really practice the Lund principle. So this is one way of thinking about history, but I would very, very much like to extend this back into the middle of the 19th century at least, to take into account lots of the other people who were working for Christian unity and for a global Christian consciousness, if you like, well back into the 19th century. And so now we move to another picture, which doesn't say anything particularly about ecumenism, but this is a delta. And rather than ecumenical history flowing gently or perhaps with some turbulence into one single river and then perfectly into the sea, I've chosen to think much more about this idea of the delta. Deltas are dangerous places. They're places that are full of ecological possibilities, but also of ecological dangers. And one of the interesting things about the delta is that it can reverse what we think about as source and destination as well, because the delta can be such a rich space, such a rich metaphor as well, that it becomes a positive destination in and of its own right. Now, possibly in other versions of the river, all the tributaries flowing together, that would also be a place of positive destination. But I think that the delta helps us to begin to understand the place of emerging new relations and themes and new pilgrimage paths, if you will, even if some of those pilgrimage paths won't be able to be walked upon. So I think that the water cycle, the cycle of water, which renews itself, offers us an elastic and non-linear metaphor that's maybe more suited to the diverse and unfinished nature of ecumenical history. And a river is really inherently very complex, and many of our European and world rivers these days are depleted as well. I mean, and how does that speak to how we think about ecumenism, about relationships with other churches, if so many of our actual rivers are depleted and in ecological crisis? But a river is constantly in motion, migrating across contexts and borders, and it's interacting with a broader cycle between heaven and earth, if you like, as well. And it irrigates hidden water tables, occasionally overflows in torrents, it floods sometimes, before ultimately arriving at a vast saline seas. But I think one of the things about these days is we are beginning to think about rivers and give rivers personhood. I don't know if you've been aware of this movement. I noticed that I think it's the River Avon in Britain there's recently been something where they're trying to give the River Avon personhood. And so that also makes me think about Christ as river, source of living water, could also be seen as the embodiment of the cycle of the river, source and destination for the faithful. So I think that this idea of water and what it brings from history, the delta is where there's a lot of silt and sedimentation going on, as you can see in this picture here. It's also a dangerous place if you go to the deltas in Nigeria, for instance. This is where there's oil, and they're very fought-over territories, so they're full of bandits as well. And there's an ever-changing environment here. And of course, the water in and of itself has huge biblical weight from the Spirit hovering over the waters in creation. And forwards, I mean, we will be across the world looking at the living source of water together during the whole time, the ecumenical time for creation, from the 1st of September to the 4th of October this year, when we're looking at the 47th chapter of Ezekiel in particular. So these sort of themes get taken up time and again. You can see it in, of course, the foot washing liturgies, which is a symbol of the ecumenical healing of memories. And I've just sort of put on the notes here, Stuttgart 2010, when Lutherans and Mennonites, after looking and working on their common past together for over a decade, washed their feet together at the Stuttgart Assembly of the Lutheran World Federation as a sign of the healing of memories. Mennonites had been put to death by Lutherans in the past and had been persecuted by them. And this was a very important sign, the river. So as we think about the river, maybe you can think about where is the ecumenical ice melting? Because what are the dark clouds of the next ethical or political storm? Where are they gathering? And is the main river draining minority voices too quickly? And as we begin to think very much about times of water scarcity, water is essential for life. It's not just a sort of luxury. It is essential. We cannot live without it. And so what does it mean to think about ecumenism as something that is liquid, that is water? And I think we need to sort of begin to take up all of those different issues. There's a lot of justice issues where we do need to act together. I think about the work of Brazilian bishops and Protestant bishops in Brazil and Protestant ministers and so on, working for water justice in their context for many decades now already, as water is privatized, as people no longer have access to their ancestral water courses. And so that's also important. So do we trust the water? Do we trust the institutional water of the church, shall we say? And I think that one of our great failures is that we often don't put the effort into making our own ecclesial structures trustworthy. We find the actual work of living together to be tedious, exhausting, anything other than part of the living water sometimes. It's sort of seen as sort of very unglamorous. Governance, whether it's at the local, national or international ecumenical level, rarely excites us, unless we perhaps get to travel to an interesting new place sometime, yeah? And it's a problem locally. It's also a problem with our democracies, in many democracies today, that we are no longer showing trust in institutions, in governance. And in some places, the church is the last bastion of local governance. I was listening to someone from Congo the other day who said he'd explained to his French students that the church was seen, or the churches were seen as the one institution in the country that could oversee the elections. And French students, when they listened to this, think, but that wouldn't be allowed by laïcité in France, by the separation of church and state. We couldn't have that in France. That would be impossible to think of that. So, and yet governance is really, really important. The new Carta Ecumenica, that was published this year, has strong passages on safeguarding responsibility within the churches, by all churches, following the scandals of systemic abuse that have taken place in nearly all of our churches and are still, unfortunately, taking place. So those are difficult issues, the issues of governance, but there are also, I think, really good signs of life. And I think it's important to look at those as well. I mean, and I'd highlight the ecological work undertaken often by younger people within our churches. Not only, it's a sign of sort of transgenerational work as well within our churches. It's got many of us to have to work ecumenically on the green church labels and so on. And the other area that I'd like to just highlight, it's a little bit of a sort of is some of the work that happens ecumenically on texts. And I don't always hold out texts as the perfect way to do ecumenism and to further ecumenical relations. But there's a WCC, a World Council document called The Church Towards a Common Vision, which was finished, I think, in 2012 and sent out to the churches, as other documents have been in the past. You may have heard of baptism, Eucharist and ministry in the past, for instance. And many churches are replying and sending back their comments on this. And it's quite interesting to see the comments from many of the Protestant churches in Europe, the Communion of Protestant Churches in Europe, are really taking issue with the question of apostolicity and saying, so there's all this insistence in the document on the issue of apostolicity. And so the Protestant churches are saying, you cannot talk about apostolicity and continue to exclude women from ministry and decision making. It's just not possible, yeah? And you cannot sort of keep telling us that we are insufficient in our apostolic succession if there is this insufficiency in your understanding and your practice of apostolicity, which excludes more than 50% of humanity from the power structures of the church. And it's been quite interesting to see that. And the Communion of Protestant Churches in Europe, the CPCE, actually stretches also to South America, because there are a couple of churches in South America that have also joined that communion. Now, this I'm just going to go over very quickly, because I'm quickly running out of time, of course. I just wanted to look at one or two things where by looking at the past, by taking the river back and looking at things from the past, we can also identify things that we didn't manage to do in the past, things that were started. So this is just a way of talking about soda packs, which was one of the WCC and Vatican's way of looking at social ethics and peace issues, and that was a really innovative way of working ecumenically. But both the Vatican and the World Council of Churches got a little bit worried about this, which was basically like a form of Caritas Internationalis and justice and peace all rolled into one. And they got a little bit worried about that and started cutting the funds back, despite this really innovative program in the 1970s. And then I wanted to put this picture here for you, because if you look carefully at it, you will see Joseph Ratzinger there on the left-hand side. I'm not sure whether he's got wine or beer in front of him, but anyway, this is at Louvain in 1971, I think in Leuven, in 1971. And so you've got all of these times when some of the best theologians from the Vatican were taking part in World Council meetings, and this was one of the first times that someone was officially part of the Faith and Order Commission from the World Council of Churches, and the only future pope to have ever served so far on a WCC commission. And this just charts things to do with soda packs. But it's also looking at how structural integration failed. And although structural integration does sometimes fail, I mean, it was part of my experience in the 1970s and early 80s of the covenant process in the United Kingdom as well. And when structural things fail, then it's very difficult to pick up the relationships afterwards. It's not easy because things are broken for a while as well. Obviously, new things can emerge, and that is the case to some extent. It became clear as a result of both Sodapax and the Humanum study failures that the Catholic Church was not going to be joining the World Council of Churches for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about later if you want to. So as we move forwards, and I'll try and finish in about 10 minutes now, or maybe a little bit earlier than that, we'll see. I also wanted to sort of encourage us to find people who have been thinking about these issues for a long time. And I wanted to particularly point to two French thinkers, one of them not involved in the church, though often working with people in churches, is Edgar Morin. He died 10 days ago at the age of, I think, 103. Extraordinary person. He was still on Twitter almost right to the end. And he's a very, very key thinker in terms of complexity. And we really need at our time people who have been thinking about complexity for a long time. And he does that through a concept of reliance, which for him is connectedness. Relier in French is to connect. And he envisions reliance as a dynamic, systemic interplay of four distinct forces: confrontation, complementarity, competition, and cooperation. And so he puts together a matrix. But within that matrix, he has a guiding principle for the interaction. And the guiding principle for interaction is radical openness to the other. And I think that's an interesting idea as we think about going into the Delta and what the Delta as a rich space of experience and perhaps a dangerous space of experience and a very new space ecclesially, what that might mean, having as a guiding principle radical openness to the other. So others might say radical compassion. But those sorts of things, and his work is very much read in South America, I believe, more so than in France, and in some parts of North America as well, though perhaps not by the current government in North America. And then Paul Ricoeur, who was a French Protestant theologian and philosopher, mainly philosopher, very interested in hermeneutics, working a great deal on recognition, but also very much involved in calling people back to look at our political, social, and personal responsibilities, and working very much on narrative identity. And I think that rivers also tell a story, and as they move into the Delta, so some of that story gets left there, builds new islands, builds new channels, and so on as well. Rick is also a philosopher who helps us rehabilitate the concept of utopia, not as an impossible dream, but as a critical space to imagine alternative realities. And I think that thinking about the Delta can help us do that as well. And he was close to the Taizé community, and research is underway at the moment on Ricoeur's contact with the nascent ecumenical movement in the 1930s. And a certain Stephen Brown, who is on this call, is undertaking some of that research. If you want to ask him to talk to you at some point, he's also married to me. But anyway, we'll think about that at another time. So as we think about the Delta, rather than the rather better behaved river, even in the Delta, and perhaps also in the better behaved river, it's difficult not to engage in a hermeneutic of suspicion towards other churches. And unfortunately, it's often the biggest church that we sometimes are suspicious of. And I'll just give you one or two of my own sort of suspicious moments recently when I realized that I had reached my limits in terms of understanding. And it's important to name them, because otherwise we won't find ways of engaging properly if we don't name our suspicions. There was a very bizarre message by Cardinal Koch to the Lambeth Conference in 2022. I won't bore you with the details of it, but it was sort of an attack on a former General Secretary of the World Council of Churches that probably nobody at the Lambeth Conference even knew. It was quite odd, and I did wonder what it was all about at the time. And I've been interested, as a feminist theologian, to see some of the Roman Catholic reactions to Sarah Mullally's election. And of course, there's not been any frontal sort of denying of it or anything, but it's been quite interesting. There was this need to suddenly insist on the fact that, of course, Anglican orders are not seen as proper orders. The Dicastery for Unity came out and said one or two things about that, both at the time of her consecration, and then, of course, also when she was visiting the Pope in Rome. And then looking at one or two of more recent publications by Pope Leo, and in particular, perhaps the most recent publication on artificial intelligence. My husband, Stephen, said to me, he said, most of the content of this document could have been written by the World Council of Churches, he said, but almost none of the content in terms of, there's no mention of how we could work together as Christian churches ecumenically on these issues. The solution to what's going wrong seems to be uniquely available through the ecclesial structures of the Catholic Church. And it's just such a shame, it seems to me, that there isn't some way of working together on that, on applying the Lunt principle. If artificial intelligence is such a challenge to humanity, then surely we should be looking again at the Lunt principle and saying, this is such a challenge, this is such an important issue, that we must all work together as Christian churches and try to come to some common ground and some ways that we can make concrete proposals. Just to be clear, some of my own church's pronouncements or lack of pronouncements or uselessness frustrate me even more, and I often return from my own synod both encouraged and fuming in equal measure. Such is governance, I suppose, and an ecumenist's work is never done. And I have to remind myself that I'm a member of this small French group called the Groupe des Dombes, set up by Abbé Paul Couturier, who was also very important at a global level as well as at a French level for reinvigorating the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity and giving it a new impetus of truly praying for unity and not praying for the return of others to another church. And the Groupe des Dombes has this insistence that we are there for the conversion of the churches, our own churches and other churches, the conversion to unity, the conversion to ecumenism. And throughout all of this, it's important to hold on, I have nearly finished, to hold on to symbolic acts, symbolic moments. I was thinking about Mike Royal, who's currently the head of Churches Together in England. He's the first Black Pentecostal leader of Churches Together in England. And it would not be possible to have an ecumenical leader from a Pentecostal church in France at the moment, although there are many very good people at that level. And so there's things to really celebrate within what's happening in all sorts of countries. And I think it's it's important to affirm that. I also was very moved in Sarah Mullally's installation by how the leaders of churches together in England did there was a very simple moment in the middle of the liturgy where they got her they signed together with her a covenant to continue on the ecumenical way together. And I thought that was both lovely and done in a very sober way. It didn't take lots of time in the service, but it was done properly, and it was fully part of the whole service. And I thought that was an important ecumenical moment, and that we should not forget that happened. It's important. And then I've put one of my favourite photos up here, which is Antje Jacqueline, the Archbishop of Stockholm, Archbishop of Uppsala, Archbishop of Uppsala, who was one of the first female heads of a church, who also visited the Vatican in many times, embracing Pope Francis when he went to Sweden to mark the beginning of the celebrations of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And that picture speaks worlds to me. The simplicity of the Pope who allowed that photo to be taken, knowing what many within his own church would be saying about that. And I can only really salute that. And I salute Pope Leo as well for receiving Sarah Mullally, and not wanting to have photos taken with her or something. It's very, very important, that kind of relationship going forwards. And I didn't want to leave this small bit here without mentioning the witness of our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land and the Kairos Palestine document, which is an important document, which needs to be read by us all, and not just in terms of our prayers, but taking issues of justice forwards for a long time to come, I fear. So the ecumenical form of water does not promise a straight and easy path for ecumenical relations in the future. But by embracing the complexity of the Delta, we can sharpen our imagination and discover new ways to configure the ecumenical space of relationships to come forwards. And those relationships have to be about building friendship and building conversations and building integrity between church leaders at the local level and between church members as well, learning to eat together. We've had a wonderful experience here in Paris last December and early January, welcoming the European gathering of Taizé young people. And it put us to work. It was hard work, but we got there, and this sense of achievement altogether was extraordinary. I'll send you the details of what else I've been writing on this bit, but our dialogues must be relational and experiential, our relations going into the future, as well as doctrinal and written. We must be able to embrace that. I think that's one of the real strengths of the Global Christian Forum movement, but also of the spirituality of prayer, of dance, of song. These things are really important. And so here's my conclusion. Towards more joyful yet uncomfortable ecumenical relations, we have to learn that ecumenical relations can't always be nice. Yeah, they have to sometimes be uncomfortable. We don't know each other as fully as we sometimes would like to pretend that we do. We're sometimes quite exotic to one another, and sometimes we're quite disdainful to one another as well. And we need to be able to get over that. And one of the ways that I wanted to try and think about that was through this photo, which is the poster from the 2010 Ecumenical Kirchentag in Germany. Mm-hmm. And it shows two young people walking on water. And it's a wonderful sort of thing. Believe in life before death. This is one of the things, the slogan of Christian Aid is, we believe in life before death. Yeah. And St. Silouan also says, keep your mind in hell and do not despair, because the work that we're going to be undertaking in ecumenical relations going forward, as it has been in the past, let's not kid ourselves, is a work of hope, of holding on to hope. When the Olaf Sixertveit became General Secretary of the World Council of Churches back in 2010, I think, he travelled to Rome, on his first visit, he's Norwegian, yeah? He likes the snow. And he took with him some very warm gloves. And he said to Pope Benedict, I've brought you these nice warm gloves. They're nice Norwegian warm gloves. They're skiing gloves. And it means that you can hold hands in the coldest of winters, he said. And he also took a book of poetry, this book of poetry, not actually this one, obviously, The Dream We Carry by a Norwegian poet called Olof Hoge. And so he took those two things with him to Rome. And I thought it was a very interesting gift in lots of ways. We can still hold hands even when things are cold, very important. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, the book that one of his pupils wrote about Rowan Williams' theology is called Difficult Gospel. And I think if we want to live within the systemic complexity of our age, we must really urgently move away from easy comfort. We need to discover what it means to live out a sort of joyful, yet uncomfortable Christianity. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran who lost his life, who was executed at the end of the Second World War by the Third Reich, preached constantly against cheap grace. And we can't have ecumenical relations that are based on cheap grace, it seems to me. And so our churches today are in a historic tension, somewhere between palliative care for dying structures and the brave planting of new seeds. And then there's also this tendency to want to buy the latest management program that will solve all of your problems. Not convinced, I'm afraid. Incarnation is not a management program. And I was reminded while I was preparing this of a powerful testimony delivered by a Protestant pastor from Syria who was visiting us here in Paris, living through the terrible destruction of the war in Syria. And he reminded us of what we are called to do as Christians. Our task is not to preserve an institution at all costs. And I think that's really a big difference between Protestants and Catholics. Our task is to remain fiercely alive, carrying the weight of Christian hope all the way to death. And that is our task. We need to be carried forth by the living river, but we also have to dare to participate in the difficult task, in the difficult gospel, and in relations that are both enriching and costly. So I think that's enough, really, isn't it? I think that's your bit, and you can now ask some questions, and I will give you a picture of some origami in a moment.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. That's a tremendous picture you've painted of the complex nature, the delta up and down, all the different facets of ecumenism. It's a much more complex picture than I had really imagined, and I'm guilty on that. But it was amazing. We're open to questions from anybody. If people would like to put them into the chat, or if you raise your hand, and you'll come up on the front page there. And I can see Marcella is first in the queue there. So Marcella, straight over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that interesting talk. I just wanted to comment. I thought you made a good point there about Pope Leo's encyclical on artificial intelligence. And it was maybe a lost opportunity to have had cooperation amongst the churches on something like that, which is such of global interest. Yeah, I just wanted to make that comment.
The Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches, of which the Roman Catholic Church is a member, has been working on artificial intelligence for some time. And so it is I do think it's a lost opportunity. And churches are working ecumenically on the issue. So perhaps at some stage that can be taken up and I don't know whether it can be rectified, but it can be taken forwards into the future.
Very good.
But thank you for the question.
Elsa, over to you. Elsa Ferrario.
Thank you so much, Jane. In Rome last November, the updated version of the Carta Ecumenica, the document that commits all European churches to working together, was signed. But while the first edition of the Carta Ecumenica in 2001 was greeted with a popular celebration, this second version was signed behind closed doors by invitation only. And after the 3 European Ecumenical Assemblies in Basel, Graz, and Sibiu, no new assemblies have been convened. What does this mean, in your opinion? Is the time for popular ecumenism over? And should we settle for summit ecumenism?
Yes. Well, I was at the last European Ecumenical Assembly in Sibiu. It nearly killed the staff who were doing it. This is one of the problems. I've been talking about structures and governance issues. It's really difficult to get 2 different organizations that are very stretched to work together. But I can only encourage you to keep on saying that we need another European Ecumenical Assembly. And one of the things that people don't understand is that Europe is a unique place for ecumenism, completely unique. We have so many churches present. We have such a long history, and we have both Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant churches of many different kinds, Anglicans, and all of it would be just wonderful to be able to have that moving forwards. So my husband has just posted the WCC consultation on digital justice and AI accountability, that you can follow the link in the chat. But I was very sad to see that the Carta Ecumenica was signed sort of behind closed doors in Rome. I think that was to do with the fact that it was happening in Rome, and so it became a church leaders event, which is a shame, because the previous times of when the previous Carta Ecumenica was published, we were encouraged to have local signings, and I know that happened in France and even sometimes in local towns. So I'd encourage you to try and get that to happen, really, and see what we can do, because it's a good document, I think, in lots of ways.
Interesting. It's no hand just up at the moment, so if I can jump in with this small little question, you spoke a lot about structures and governance and how nobody really wants to deal with it, but you need to deal with it. One of the areas that gives me optimism, and I know it's within our own church and the Catholic Church, is the German Synodal Path and the German Synodal Conference. And after 5 or 6 years, they've drawn up quite a complex governance structure, but it's very clever as well. A lot of thought and work has gone into that with 27, 81 people, etc. I'm sure you're aware of some of the outlines of that. Does that sort of work that's gone on there with the synodal process, does that give you hope for ecumenism?
I think it gives me hope for the church. However, you have no doubt also seen how the German synodical process has been received in Rome, and that gives me slightly more cause for concern. I have been incredibly impressed with the seriousness with which the German Catholic Church has taken the synodical process forwards. It's really to be saluted. And one has to hope in all of these processes going forwards that some essence of it will not be lost. One has to hope that. I mean, even though my own experience of structural evolution is that doesn't always bring something out. But I think that it's very interesting for me living in the reality of the French, within the reality of the French Roman Catholic Church, which is not at all like that, and yet much more powerful in lots of ways, doesn't have the same amount of money, of course, as the Roman Catholic Church in Germany has. But I can just say, for instance, we were talking about the European Ecumenical Assemblies earlier. I was at the first Ecumenical Kirchentag and at the second Ecumenical Kirchentag. I couldn't go in 2021 when it was COVID orientated and so on, but it was incredibly difficult to get the two structures, which are two strong structures. Yeah, the Katholikentag and the Kirchentag. Yeah. These are two strong structures. Getting them to work together was quite hard work, and it was difficult. I mean, and these are people who get on with each other. You know, it's not, but it's just two very different ways of doing things. It was not easy. I mean, of course, and it's church leaders who are not easy anyway. I mean, because we're not. But yes, I mean, what's happening in Germany is extraordinary, really. Exemplary, I would say. But then, as I'm a Protestant, I would say that, I suppose, because they're being accused of being too Protestant. So.
Yes, thank you. I can get back into the picture.
I can see.
But I was very struck at the very beginning. You mentioned the kenotic aspect. And I was kind of wondering to what extent, as Christian and especially as churches, the kenosis aspect of our faith, which is central, of course, it's Jesus' own example of the divine kenosis, the letting go, the unto death, you know, the service. In our structures, which really value power, and ultimately how, you know, the resistance, I suppose, at individual level, of course, but even more, I think, also in terms of institutions, where relations of power really are very present. And kenosis, there is lip service to kenosis, but in fact, it's not, I was going to say, it's not the main principle at work, really. It's it's power, unfortunately. And within our own Roman Catholic Church, when it comes to women, again, it's very much issues of power, balances of power, who has the power, who can make things happen. And kenosis is so, I was going to say so radical. It's the ultimate radical. It's, that it's, to embrace it. And I think to embrace it would generate, and is the only way to generate something new, because it's resurrection. Without kenosis, there's no new life. But I don't see that happening very much, really.
And it didn't happen to my church in the end either, you see, to the United Reformed Church. It has this kenotic statement in its basis of union. And yet it has never managed to no longer exist because the wider structural unity plan failed. And the churches who might be able to undertake that now do not have the energy to do that. And I say that like that. And many of the people from what we call the free churches in the UK or in Britain rather than perhaps in Ireland, those people, as their local places of worship have closed down, quite a large proportion of them now go and worship in a local Anglican church. And that's changing the nature of the Church of England as well, which is becoming in many places more Protestant and sometimes a little bit more radical as well, more politically engaged. That's been one of the big changes that I would say about the Church of England at the moment. But it's very difficult to give up privilege. And, the Church of England bishops are not going to give up their place in the House of Lords, are they? And it's very hard to give up those places. And yet at the same time, when you're a minister or a priest, perhaps, in ministry, just local ministry or other forms of ministry, I sometimes say, nous sommes du grain à moudre. We are, we're grains to be milled. We're grain to be milled, And I think that's the case in lots of institutions for people these days as well. And so the kenotic part of things is that we're being ground down by the system to some extent. We're giving our lives to systems that don't work properly.
We're running near the end of our time.
But there's Maeve who's got a question, I think.
Maeve, and then Hubert van Beek as well. I saw he was trying to raise his hand. Maeve Walsh first, please. Yeah.
I'm quite happy to leave the highbrow stuff to all of you here. My comment would be as a member of local Catholic Church, and there is a lot of ecumenical activity goes on in our town. And part of, one in particular that I'm involved with is Ballycastle Church Action. And that's, we do, part of our constitution is that we have an ordained minister from each of the churches. That's Catholic Church, Church of Ireland and Presbyterian. And we have 3 lay members from each of the parishes. And we have a few independent people. But part of the constitution is that the clergy do not hold office. And so we have actually 3 women leading. Our chairperson is a woman. And I'm the secretary, and Church of Ireland, which they're changing at the minute, changing insofar as their rector has left, but there's a new rector coming in September. But the assistant director we have at the minute, she has 1 more year to do to qualify her. as a full minister, you'll know that better than me. But Shona is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And well, I hope we won't lose her when the new rector comes. But some of the things that we do together is we have the blessing of the boats every year. We have a Good Friday walk. We have 2 major projects. One is a telephone service. It's called Good Morning Ballycastle, and a number of housebound people are phoned out through the week, and you can have, between Monday and Friday, you can have as many phone calls as you wish. We have a food bank. We have an ecumenical prayer group, although I have to admit it's mainly Catholic, but nonetheless, there's always an input from the other churches as well. And what else have we? Anyway, that's enough to be saying. I'm usually giving out about my own Catholic church because of what they're not doing. But the point is, this is mainly run by the laity. Now, we haven't as much input. Well, I'm on the pastoral council of our church, okay. But it's still, yes, Father, no Father, 3 bags full, Father, you know. So that's my input.
Thank you so much, Maeve. That's a really positive note, I think, I mean, not the 3 bags full, Father, but I mean, the rest of it is a very positive
That's the reality,
but somebody sent me a note in the chat that Hubert van Beek wants to have a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you please go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Hubert.
Thank you. Hi, Jane. You hear me?
Yes.
You hear me? Yes. I have a question, Jane, about the metaphors you've been using. As a WCC colleague, I'm of course very familiar with the river picture. And it's very nice also that you made it clear that the newer version of that picture does also include Vatican II and could in the future also include other ecumenical movements that have happened outside the present purview of the World Council. Where I got into trouble a little bit listening to you is the metaphor of the delta. And I would like to ask you to explain that a little bit more, what you mean by that, because most rivers end up in a delta. I mean, many rivers at least end up in a delta. Now, is the river of the ecumenical chart, that metaphor, is that necessarily also ending up into a delta? For me, the delta metaphor is more what the situation we are in at the moment. In your first chart, which I tried to read while you were speaking, you also quoted, but you did not say that in your presentation, the way in which, since a couple of years, the purpose of the World Council of Churches, and to some extent the purpose of the ecumenical movement, therefore, is formulated in the Constitution of the World Council. And so, if I carry on with the metaphor of the river, where will it come out? Where will that stream of the river, that flow of the river, where will it end up in a delta? That's where I have my difficulty with your metaphor.
I understand that, Hubert, and I think you're right to question all metaphors. Any pictures need to be questioned, don't they? But I think one of the reasons that I wanted to take the river chart metaphor further, and I've been doing it for quite a while now. And actually, the person who gave me the idea for the delta was Odair Pedro Mateos, who's a former director of Faith and Order at the World Council of Churches. And the idea of the delta spoke to me. But actually, you see, the delta is this space where fresh water and salt water mix. It's the space where you've got this space that is continually in flux and changing. And so although you've done a lot of, I suppose you could say, a lot of this effort of structuring things, The delta is a space where everybody has to let go. But in the end, the water does go through. And in the end, the delta is actually the space for the relationships to bear fruit to some extent. I mean, because they're very fruitful places, often deltas, as well as being dangerous places to some extent, where we don't know the way and where we have to rely on one another and when we have to rely on friendships and good relationships and on trust to go forwards. And I think that the water that goes through the delta and is in the delta, well, it's evaporating and it will become part of the river again, won't it? I mean, that's what the whole cycle of water comes to. I didn't put my picture that we all had at school of the water cycle, yeah, being circular like it is. But I also didn't mention in what I was saying the Ecumenical Water Network, which I was very, very involved in when I was at the World Council of Churches, on the 7 Weeks for Water campaign and so on. And it seemed to me that the Ecumenical Water Network, which really brought together the activist side of things. We're working for justice. We're working for something that's vital. And we cannot even begin to think about water without thinking about baptism and about the fact that we have an incomplete water flow where baptism is concerned, and the recognition and our work on baptism is still incomplete. So I suppose it came from there. But I think you're right. I need to make the work on the delta a bit more explicit, Hubert, and I have done that in other places, but I didn't do that this evening to the same extent, and I'm sorry about that. But you should invite Hubert to come and talk to you sometime, because he really knows things about the Global Christian Forum, and he has really travelled the whole of the world. So you should invite him sometime.
Very good. Thank you, Jane. Thank you all very, very much indeed. I'd like to just call on Celine says she'd like to see the origami if you have it there, Jane.
Oh, yes. Okay, I'll see what I can find.
I've been waiting for it.
Hang on a sec. Let me see if I can do it.
Elsa, you're next.
Yes.
Let me see what I can do. Let me see. Just keep going and I'll get there. You do what you've got. You've got prayers next, yeah? So I'll...
No, we have a word of thanks from Elsa Ferrario for you.
Okay. Let me see. More I need to do. Share. Here we go. Yes. I think I've given you origami.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Our little boats.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wow. Multicolored.
All our little boats.
Unity in diversity.
They're the old service sheets from Sunday mornings, which I've thrown ink all over and then turned into boats and then given back to parishioners the next week.
Lovely. Thank you, Jane. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
If we can switch over now to allow Elsa to say a few words of thanks to Jane for that lovely presentation to us this evening. Elsa.
So, dear Jane, thank you so much for your wonderful report. Your words made our hearts dance, as they did in 1964, when Pope Paul VI and Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras embraced each other, lifting their mutual excommunication in effect since 154. As they danced on October the 31st, 2016, when in Lund Cathedral you showed us the photo a little while ago, the primate of the Church of Sweden, Antti Jackelin, embraced Pope Francis. A hug between brother and sister, finally after 500 years of separate journeys, resentments, and misunderstandings. We heard the Psalm 133 echo, how beautiful, how sweet when brothers and sisters live together. But it is also a demanding word, a beauty at a high price, as Bonhoeffer said, you remind us a little while ago. In the new version of the Carta Ecumenica, signed by the European Orthodox, Protestant and Catholic churches last November, the verb commit resounds 14 times. We, European churches of different denominations, is written, commit ourselves to seeking the visible unity of the Church of Jesus Christ, unity in diversity. We commit ourselves to listening together to the Word of God, to pray together, to progress towards Eucharistic hospitality, to share the Eucharist. We commit ourselves to the healing of memories and to reconciliation. We commit ourselves to defending the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, to denounce abuses, holding those responsible and those who protect them accountable. We commit to continuing dialogue among our churches and acting together. We commit to recognizing the space of young people in our churches and encouraging their participation in decision-making processes. We commit to strengthening the position of women in the church and in society and defending their equal rights, to resist attempts to exploit religion and the church for political ends. We commit to strengthening relations with Jews and Judaism, with Muslims and Islam. We commit to dialogue with other religions and worldviews. We commit to peace in Europe and around the world, always prioritizing nonviolent approaches to conflict resolution. We commit to safeguarding creation, of which we are a part, by adopting equitable and sustainable lifestyles with future generations in mind. We commit to defending the rights and well-being of migrants, deconstructing racism and xenophobia. We commit to promoting digital literacy and a critical approach to technology for its ethical use. How wonderful it would be if this were the commitment of all our communities, to do together what we can do together, the Lund principle, as we heard. Instead, ecumenism is not part of our ordinary pastoral care. It is perceived as something extra that can be done without, amid so many urgent needs. Thank you, dear Jane, for helping us keep the dream alive, the dream of Jesus, that it takes one to bear witness to him, and the dream of our mothers and fathers who worked to build bridges, not walls, between our churches. In Italy, there was the shining figure of Maria Vignani, a courageous Catholic woman who in 1946 built from the ruins of war a lay association for ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. When the bishop learned that she was meeting with Protestant pastors in Venice to read the Bible together, he said to her, "My daughter, do you really want to lose yourself?" But Maria was not discouraged and stubbornly pursued the project that the spirit of unity had placed in her heart. We dreamed the dream of the women and men of faith who gathered in Seoul in 1990 for the International Ecumenical Convocation for Peace and Justice, and then again in Kingston in 2011. Thank you for helping us say, like Martin Luther King or Olof Hoga, "I have a dream." We have a dream that our squares will once again be filled with women and men, young and old, as they were for the European Ecumenical Assemblies in Basel, Graz, and Sibiu. That our Eucharistic tables will no longer be separated, that our sons and daughters can receive ecumenical catechesis for Christian initiation, that we can feel like sisters and brothers, different but united in the same faith, that we can dance the joy of meeting, as I did in 2022 in Karlsruhe at the pre-assembly of the World Council of Churches entitled A Just Community of Women and Men. Here is the bracelet I've been wearing ever since. So thank you, dear Jane, for the joy and hope you have given us this evening, and for the dreams you help us realize, like a river in flood that no one can stop.
Thank you, Elsa. Very, very well put. Greatly appreciate that. I can now like to call on Christian Bascu for our closing prayer. Christian.
Every single act of ours, O Lord, can become a sacrament. If it's your spirit that infuses them, if it's your presence that throbs beneath. Help us discover, help us bring out the divine and sacred dimension of our lives, of our encounters and pursuits, be they mundane, voluntary, ecumenical, or political, for them to acquire an ultimate meaning, a taste of eternity. Let our actions be your actions, our commitments be your commitments. Give us, above all, the power to love, but always better, always more. Amen.
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 Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Jane. Thank you all who contributed to this meeting this evening. We will make the video available sometime in the next week, hopefully. And
Thank you so much for the invitation. And remember, many waters cannot quench love.
Here, here. Special thank you to Valerie as well, who's in the background. And I know she has not been well, but she's done a great job for us tonight again with the Zoom room and looking after us here. And Jean-Pierre Schmitz as well. Thank you for bringing Jane to us. It was a tremendous evening, and we're very, very much in debt to you and to Jane. Thank you all very much. Good night.